This is the Comics Alternative Webcomics, reviews of Hubris, Hobo Lobo of Hamelin, and Runners. Hello and welcome to another episode of the Comics Alternative Webcomics. I'm Derek.
And I'm Sean, and we're two guys with advanced degrees talking about webcomics.
That's right. And on the November webcomics episode, Sean and I are going to be looking at 3 webcomics, 2 currently ongoing and 1 already completed, as we always do. We're going to begin with Greg Craven's Hubris. After that, Stevan Živadinović's Hobo Lobo of Hamelin. And then we're going to wrap up with Sean Wang's Runners. But before we get to those webcomics, we want to let all of you know that this episode of the Comics Alternative Webcomics is brought to you by the great folks at Discount Comic Book Service. Go to their website, dcbservice.com, for all of your comics pre-ordering needs. There, you're going to find all DC, Marvel, Image, and Dark Horse titles at 40% off of the cover price if you pre-order. For all of the other publishers, you'll find that those discounts are 20 to 35% off the cover price. And every single month, you're going to find some wonderful specials. Sometimes those specials are at 45% off cover price, sometimes at 50% off cover, but often you can find discounts that are more impressive than that.
And we also have to point out their sister comic site, mydigitalcomics.com, if you prefer your comics in electronics format, which I can understand a lot of you might, given you're listening to a webcomics podcast. They have a lot of your favorite publishers from Image and Top Cow and Action Labs and lots of fun guys like that. And all of their comics are available in PDF and CBZ formats that are all DRM free. Always a personal favorite. I always recommend that. And any purchases made on mydigitalcomics.com earns 5% towards your DCBS purchase. So you get a kind of a double bonus just by purchasing the electronic version from mydigitalcomics.com.
That's great. So whether you like your comics in digital or hard copy format, you can't go wrong with our sponsor, Discount Comic Book Service and mydigitalcomics.com. Go there for all of your comics pre-ordering needs, and after you do get your material there, please be sure to send them an email and tell them that Sean and Derek sent you. Sean, how have things been going with you?
Been going well. Very busy. You and I were talking a little bit earlier. It's just kind of wrapping things up for the end of the year at work, and a lot of people trying to get their last-minute projects in so they have something good to look on their what I did this year thing that they have to write up for their boss at the end of the year, and so trying to finish all that up. It's keeping me very busy, but good otherwise. How about yourself?
Yeah, it's the same. This is a busy time of the year, but it seems busier than other times of the year where you may have the same amount of work. At least that's always been my experience in terms of working in a university. Well, both as a student and also as a professor. Around the time of Thanksgiving to the end of the semester, I liken it to going down a very, very steep hill on a roller coaster. It's disorienting. You scream, you feel nauseated, and then before you know it, things are over and you wonder what the hell just happened.
Now, when do you guys have until the end of the term? How far past Thanksgiving for that?
It'll be a couple of weeks into December.
Okay.
Yeah. So, and the thing about working at a university as faculty, you do get pretty darn decent breaks between semesters, and so I can't complain about that.
Sure.
Now, my wife works at UT Dallas as well, but she's not faculty, so she has to be there at times that I don't have to be. But still, we've worked it to where we will have enough time to do our holiday travels, both to North Carolina and to Indiana.
Yes. We need to get together. You're up in my neck of the woods these days.
Yeah.
At least for a little while.
We talked about that last year. Maybe me, you, Jean, and possibly even Gwen, because she's up in Kalamazoo. getting together, but we weren't able to work it. I don't know if we're going to be able to with all four of us this year because my time's going to be a little more limited. But who knows? Maybe we can work something out. It's interesting in that as long as I've been talking with both you and Gene on the podcast, I've met neither of you.
Yeah. We're fun guys, though, in person, really.
Yeah. I look forward to seeing that for myself in person.
Yeah. Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. It'll be fun. If we get a chance to do that, if we can work the schedules.
Yeah.
But we'll see.
Well, Sean, we have a good number of webcomics to discuss, and we're going to, in addition to that, we're also going to be checking in with Jim McClain and Paul Schultz, as we have been doing over the past few months, and see how things are going with their webcomic in process, Poe and the Mysteriads. But let's begin with the first webcomic that we're going to be discussing this month, and this is Hubris, with an exclamation mark. So, Hubris! By Greg Cravens.
Yeah, it's a lot different than a lot of the webcomics we've looked at in the past, in that this is really the first one that's kind of written more as a gag strip, right? A lot of the stuff we've been looking at have been these extended serials. And while Hubris does have an ongoing storyline, the format is more akin to a newspaper comic or a gag strip, where there's 3, 4, 5 panels and then a punchline of some kind.
Exactly.
But it does have, like I said, it does have this kind of ongoing narrative. And that's one of the reasons why I thought it might be interesting to discuss it this month, is in kind of looking at it in that context and seeing the overall story relative to the gag story and see kind of how that falls one way or the other.
Right. Now, we should mention to our listeners that they can find Hubris at hubriscomics.com. And that's one word, hubriscomics.com. And this has been going on since November of 2010, and we have current updates, so it's currently ongoing. And in terms of, I guess, establishing a premise or what Hubris is all about, there are a couple of lines from their About page, or from Craven's About page, although it's called a What the page instead of About, that kind of sums up everything. It says that Hubris features the exploits of a small outdoors business owner, his family, friends, and customers, and bicycles. There are also kayaks, skateboards, trampolines, and various other outdoor activities in the comic. And when it comes right down to it, that more or less sums up Hubris.
Which is, that's one of the things that's interesting, is that it's, despite being kind of that simple premise, he seems to get a lot of mileage. Like we said, we're going on 6 years now. It seems to get a lot of mileage out of that singular premise, which is interesting.
Right. But I think that's the nature of a gag strip, because when you think of other things like this, either in print or digital form, or let's say newspaper strips, something as classic as Peanuts, right? Schultz's Peanuts. It would have a description at least as short, if not a little shorter. It's not so much how complex the premise is or the situation of the strip. It's what the creator is able to do gag-wise with the little that of the basis that establishes everything. So whether it be Charles Schultz with Peanuts, or Calvin and Hobbes, or any of the classic newspaper strips, there's really not much to the foundation of the strip. It's how the creator uses the various parts to tell jokes or to set some kind of touching scene each day or each strip.
Yeah, and I think it's worth pointing out that we're making several references to newspaper strips. If the name Greg Cravens sounds familiar, it's because he is actually a newspaper strip artist or creator. He worked on the other strip, or continues to work on, I should say, the Buckets. It's been a newspaper strip that's been going on for I don't know how many years. I think he didn't create the series originally, but he took it over, I think, in about 2000, and has been running that strip since that time, pretty much single-handedly. I think there was some kind of weird little intern period where he was either ghosting or doing backgrounds or something like that while the previous artist, Scott Stamptis, was doing the majority of the heavy lifting. But when he stepped out, Greg Cravens took it over and ran the Buckets strip, and has been running the Bucket strip since 2000. And then Hubris then comes along in 2010. And I think there's so he's got, by that point, 10 years of experience doing a newspaper strip before getting into Hubris. So there's clearly, he's kind of got that experience level of here's how to craft a strip, here's how to draw a strip. He knows the regularity of the deadlines and all that. So there's clearly a lot of parallels between what he's doing or what he had been doing before with what he started up in Hubris.
Yeah, exactly. And you can tell through reading the various installments of Hubris that he has some newspaper strip writing under his belt, because even though the beat of Hubris may be a little formulaic, you kind of expect it to be so, but he pulls it off very well. And I say that because I've read a number of webcomic strips that are somewhat similar to this, that, especially by first-time creators, they attempt to do the same thing, but the jokes seem to either fall flat sometimes, or maybe they're a little overly formulaic. In other words, they just don't have the rhythm down to the gag strip beat. And in reading through Hubris, you can tell almost from the beginning that Cravens is an old hand at what he's doing.
And one of the other benefits, or one of the other positives, I think, in how he's telling the story too, most of the jokes and most of the humor comes from the characters themselves, right? So he's got this cast of very interesting, unique characters, and the humor primarily comes from their interactions, right? They're just kind of going along doing whatever it is that they're doing, and there may be some kind of situational type comedy, but most of it's still character driven. That this is Hubris's reaction. Hubris, by the way, is the main character. We should point out it's a little bit of a play on the word, an adjective or name, I guess. But Hubris is the main character. A lot of the humor comes from his reactions to things and how his younger brother acts in the store, or how his girlfriend acts when they go out hiking, or how one of his employees acts in customer interactions, with trying to run this store. So there's a lot of, I think, interesting characters going on there, and the fact that the story, the humor is all character driven, or primarily character driven, I think is one of the big assets of the strip.
Okay, that's right. Now let's describe some of the main characters here, because we were talking about the simplicity of the strip's premise, but there's a lot that Cravens does with these few simple parts. Same thing with the characters. There's just very few characters that we have here, but it's the intermixture in various ways of these characters that allow Cravens to continue this strip for at least 6 years now. So, the main figure, Hubris, is outdoor sports shop owner. He's very much into outdoor sports. He owns the store himself. This is not part of a larger corporation or franchise that owns it. He loves outdoor sports. He loves to play. But he's kind of a bigger guy. He's not in the best shape, but that's okay. I mean, the kind of sports that he's interested in, things like kayaking, bicycles, mountain climbing, hiking, things of that sort, very different from, let's say, team sports. And in fact, there's a minor character that we see every now and again, and he's a coach. What's his name? Coach Potato? which is a play on couch potato, of course.
Yeah.
Who has a completely different take on what sports is. So he doesn't respect the kind of sports that Hubris is into. But again, that tells us everything about Hubris's character. And then there's his younger brother that you had mentioned, Carlisle, although Carlisle likes to go by the name Paste. I guess that he considers that something like a street name.
Right.
And, he's a much younger brother, and he sees himself as hip, and his older brother Hubris as completely out of touch with things. And then there is Hubris's significant other or girlfriend, who is a doctor, and in fact he meets her for the first time when he goes to see a doctor. He's needing the assistance of a doctor. Her name is Kara Biner. She's also a big outdoors sports person, so that's one of the reasons why they really hit it off. And then there is a rival, what had been a rival outdoor sports shop business person, a guy by the name of Lowell. But he worked for one of these larger franchises, at least initially. Then he lost his job. And so he has a background in business, but not in outdoor sports. So there's that kind of contrast and tension between Hubris and Lowell. And then there are a variety of other characters. There's the character, what's his name? Is it Kelly, his African-American friend?
Yeah, with the video camera.
Yes, yes. There's Kelly. And then there are the other characters, though, that we see kind of come and go very minimally. But I think the ones that we just mentioned, this is, I guess, what you could call the cast.
Yeah, primary cast, certainly.
Yeah, the primary cast. So, and from again, those few bits, Cravens is able to come up with a new strip, every single time. And, maybe sometimes the kind of humor may seem a little repetitive, but I don't think that Cravens really repeats himself too much in this strip. I think it's relatively fresh, as you would expect from a newspaper strip.
Yeah, and I think there's I like the message of the strip overall, too, right? Because most of these primary characters have a fairly happy-go-lucky attitude, right? They're happy to just go out and ride a bike for the sake of riding a bike. And, they still, I got to take care of the store and, be kind of responsible and whatever, but that doesn't mean I can't have fun doing it. And I think that's, I really like that message that sends, because it's not just Hubris that feels that way, but Kara certainly, and some of his other friends, Kelly to a lesser degree. Paste and Lowell tend to be the not exactly adversaries at all times, but they certainly present a different worldview, and because of that, I think they also are shown to not be as happy and or successful generally because of these kind of differing worldviews. They're both a little bit more superficially focused, making sure that they get a little bit more selfish views on things and trying to be a little more capitalistic and whatever. Whereas where Hubris is he wants to make enough money to earn a living, but he also wants to share the joy of bike riding and unicycle riding and kayaking and all of that, paintball tournaments, that kind of thing. He just wants to share that joy with as many people as he can.
Right.
And I think that's a very positive message. That's on top of the humor that's already kind of embedded in the nature of the strip, the overall message is a positive one as well. It's not a humor out of spite or meanness at any point, really.
Exactly. And one of the earliest strips, I think, kind of sums up Hubris's characters, or his character, in that there's a guy standing outside, I guess kind of a homeless guy, someone who's down and out, and he has a sign that he's holding up that says, "We'll work for food." And this guy's looking to the side in a suspicious way. And the person he's looking at to that side is Hubris, who's holding up a sign and smiling, and says that his sign says, "We'll play for food."
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, and that very much gets to the point, I think.
Yeah. Let's talk a little bit about the style of Hubris. And I wanted to know if you, in reading this, and you've been familiar with this for a lot longer than I have. In fact, you were the one who introduced me to Hubris. Since you've been reading it for a while, have you noticed I don't know if I want to call it a refinement of the art style or just maybe a change? Because refinement suggests that something's better than it was. But if you go back and look at the early strips, I think things are much more clear lined, straightforward in terms of the color. But then the more recent strips, let's say over the past year or two, seems to have a little more detail and texture to them. So my question to you, Sean, is, as you've been reading through Hubris, did you notice the art evolving or changing over time? Or because you read this on a fairly regular basis, did it really not occur to you that those kind of changes were taking place incrementally?
Yeah, honestly, I totally did not see that change happening until we decided we were going to look at the strip for this show. And I started going back, and then I was like, oh, yeah, wow, he has changed that quite a bit. In terms of his style and approach. And I don't know that's necessarily a bad thing. It's probably makes things easier for him, I would presume, as he's streamlining his art processes and getting better and more used to the characters and that. But yeah, no, and reading in kind of a day-to-day basis, that's not something I noticed at all. But in looking back, it seems like he's got a lot more consistent with his character designs. I think there's a little bit of, I don't want to say fuzziness, but a little, I guess, of variability in, faces and gestures and postures and stuff in the early strips. Not that you couldn't tell that a character looked like a character, but I think he hadn't quite figured out, how this character looked at this particular angle, and so it looks a little off.
Right.
I think he got a little bit better at that as he got more practice with the characters. And I think he started. Yeah, it's interesting. There's certainly a lot of interesting things going on in the background with the texturing and whatever that you mentioned. Whereas the early stuff, I think he focused more on trying to actually draw the entire store or whatever the background was at the time into the background, which ended up competing a little bit with the foreground characters. I think the texturing and some of the other things that he's doing make it for an easier read overall, especially for like a gag strip when you're supposed to just kind of run through it at a glance. The way he's got things textured and laid out puts a distinct foreground background into effect, whereas he didn't have as much of that as pronounced, I guess, in the earlier strips.
Exactly. And another change that I've noticed from the earlier strips to the most recent ones is that he's changed the layout of his strip, whereas when we start off, almost every single one is laid out horizontally, like a newspaper strip. So you have that classic 4-panel layout that runs horizontally. But over the past couple of years, at least, he has these comics, usually, again, 4 panels, that run down vertically. And I'm wondering if he made this shift, given the nature of webcomics and knowing that most people who consume webcomics, and I don't know this statistically, I would just guess, that most people who consume webcomics do this on some kind of mobile device, either on a smartphone or a tablet of some sort.
Yeah, actually, I do. I was reading it on a regular basis when he made that switch, and he had some note at that time.
Okay.
I forget if it was in a blog post or whatever, but he did make reference to, at the time, he was seeing a definite uptick in his web traffic versus his desktop traffic, and he flatly said, it makes more sense for people who are reading on these smaller screens with the more vertical format. Makes more sense to present the comic strip in that fashion. So that was very much a conscious decision in definite reaction to the mobile traffic that he was getting.
Yeah. Let's say a few words about the design of the site, because, almost every month that's something that we point out with most, if not all, of the webcomics that we discuss. As with a lot of webcomics that we looked at on this series, Cravens does utilize a good number of ads. I don't know if the ads get in the way of the enjoyment or the reading of the webcomics. He apparently is using Google Ads, which, is okay. I know there's a banner up at the top, and then there are 2 or 3 on the side from Google Ads as you scroll down. What does, though, seem to get a little more cluttered is on top of the ads are the other graphics that he has on either side of the strip, on both the left and the right, where he has people can click to, let's say, the Hubris archives, the RSS feed, contacting him via email, his Patreon link, the Outdoor Galore store, Talk About Toys link. And the graphics are great. It's just they're quite colorful, a little flamboyant in terms of style. And it's a good thing that I guess these appear underneath the strip, because if I were seeing these on either side of that vertical layout, the 4 panels going down, then it definitely would be distracting my attention. Although one thing that does distract my attention, and I'm curious what you think of this, is the faint background of the Hubris online site, where it has kind of a faded Hubris strip. You see what I'm talking about?
Yeah.
And I'm wondering if basically just a solid color would better suit his visual purposes.
Honestly, I'm certainly seen it. I'm aware it's there. It doesn't bother me, though. I think in part because the strip itself still has like a white background immediately behind that, right? So it's not like the strip doesn't like butt up right next to that background at any point, really. So I don't know. That's for my purposes. There's enough of a visual break that I kind of just focus on the strip, and I don't need to worry about the other stuff. And I agree with you that he's got all of those other links. For the Facebook, there's Twitter, his archive, email, all of that stuff. Those are kind of there's enough of them with enough different colors and kind of spot placement approach to things that it looks a little cluttered. But since, to your point, since all of that occurs below the strip itself, it doesn't really bother me. In terms of enjoying the strip, I don't know that it serves him well, particularly, because if you're trying to get to his archive or trying to get to an email contact or something like that, it might be a little problematic to try and read through each one, because he's got different colors and different fonts and all of these different approaches going on with all these things. It makes it a little difficult to find, for example, where his Facebook link is or his Twitter profile is or that kind of thing. Mm-hmm. But if you're just interested in just reading the comic, they don't get in the way at all, because, like you said, they appear all below the comic strip itself.
Right. Another thing I liked about Hubris is the way that we can scroll through one strip to the next. And, as you would expect, we can move ahead to the next strip, forward or backward. We can go to the very beginning or the very end. But something that I think is suitable specifically for this kind of strip, this gag strip, is that we have the option of randomizing what we see. And so if, in the middle of the forward and backward arrows, we have a die with question marks on it. And so you click on that and it takes you to a random strip. And for the most part, that works really well, because you don't necessarily need to have read the strip that was immediately previous to what you're just reading. Now, there are some stories, brief as they are, that are made up of maybe 4 to 5 different strips, as you find with newspaper strips as well. And so those may not randomize nearly as well. But for the most part, the majority of the strips you can take out of chronological order and still enjoy them.
Yeah, and I think that speaks well to his storytelling ability, right? To Craven's storytelling ability, because he's able to craft these stories in such a way that, there is this overarching narrative of what's going on. And, he had, for a while there was I think it was probably maybe a year or so, where he was running this. What did he call it? Some kind of outdoor festival that was being promoted, that the Hubris and his shop were promoting. And they had all these events, and it was great fun, and everybody doing all these wacky, weird things. Is part of this overarching story, but at the same time, to your point, you can drop into the middle of it, and by and large, you didn't need to read anything before or after. I think that speaks well to his storytelling ability, that you're able to pick up anywhere in the middle, keep going, just start going, and you're perfectly fine in figuring out what's going on. And some of that is due to the fact that it's a gag strip primarily. That's like the same thing. You can pick up any installment of Peanuts, any installment of Garfield, any installment of Calvin and Hobbes, and it stands on its own very well. Part of the nature of that kind of gag strip format. But the repeated reading on a day-to-day, week-to-week basis yields a larger result, I think, a larger sense of satisfaction in getting the whole story.
Yep. So again, the URL of Hubris is hubriscomics.com. So, definitely check it out, especially if your enjoyment in comics fall into the gag strip variety. So let's move on to the second webcomic that we're looking at this month, and this is Hobo Lobo of Hamelin. This is by Stevan Živadinović, and I guess that's how you pronounce his last name. And you can find this webcomic at hobolobo.net. That's one word, Hobo Lobo, and then .net. And this one began in January of 2011, and it's still going, although we should mention that the last time Hobo Lobo of Hamelin was updated was July of 2014.
Yeah, it has been a while.
Yeah, so it's been a couple of years, a little more than 2 years. But one of the reasons why Sean and I wanted us to look at Hobo Lobo of Hamelin is that it's a very experimental comic. It's multimedia. It's somewhat animated. Sometime the kind of animation that we find is what we've seen in other webcomics that are animated. But also much of the animation is due to the layout of the graphics that occur as you scroll through.
Yeah.
That gives you kind of the sense of depth and even 3D-ness.
Yeah, what he's done is, before I get into that, maybe just say, as you can judge by the name or guess by the name, Hobo Lobo of Hamelin is kind of a spin or a take on the old Pied Piper of Hamelin story, right? So, there's some kind of problem going around in the town. There's a piper, I guess, for lack of a better word, who can rid the city of all the rats.
Or he's kind of a Renaissance man in terms of being able to repair things and fix things. He's a wolf, and so thus the name Lobo. And he wanders around. He's a hobo, so he's a Hobo Lobo.
Hobo Lobo, yeah. And he's basically hired by the mayor to get rid of all the unwanted elements. When the mayor decides he's not going to pay him, then Hobo Lobo goes back and says, okay, well, fine, I'll just lead all your children out. Right.
And that's where the last, I guess what the creator's calling a page, because a page is in different sections, and we'll describe that in a minute. But right now we're only up to page 7, and that's where the story is left off, where Hobo Lobo comes in, gets rid of the rats, and the rats are the ones that are causing the problem in Hamelin. And in fact, they're described as, crack rats, right? So, there's a really bad influence in terms of their drug use. And so Hobo Lobo gets rid of them. The mayor refuses to pay Hobo Lobo after he promised him he'd do so. And then on page 7, again, the latest installment, Hobo Lobo is starting to do something with the children, but we don't know exactly what. Now, if you go to the story index, you'll find that of these 7 pages, which I guess you could call, instead of pages, maybe chapter would be a better way of describing what these are. Page 1 was created from January to February of 2011. Page 2, March to May of 2011. 3, June to December of 2011, and then page 4, January to February of 12, page 5, June to July of 2012, 6, August 2012 to September 2013. So this is where things begin to slow down a little bit. And then page 7, July 2014. And so that's where we leave off. And the creator, Živadinović, even gives statistics over how often he updates things. And in fact, he describes in the story index, he says updates happen on average and right now it's at 23.3 days. Recently, they've happened, most recently, 72.3 days apart. Last update happened 835.2 days ago. I'm probably very sorry stuff. As he's right, I'm probably very sorry stuff is late. I suspect I may have a good reason for it. Twitter or Tumblr may know more. Also, check out stats over time. And if you check that, you can even check the stats of when he's updated this stuff. Now, we should mention this. Okay, I'm assuming that English is not Živadinović's first language. But the Hobo Lobo of Hamelin you can find in not only English but also French and Spanish. And Živadinović seems to have a really good sense of humor. In the about information that you find out, he describes the webcomic this way. Hobo Lobo of Hamelin is a thing by a dude who's all like, I'm going to make a thing. And then he did, or is doing, or, whatever. This dude can be found on the internet. He makes adventurous, haute couture, bespoke, graceful, exciting internets for a living. Hire him to make you one, and you can click there and find out about contact information. And so you can tell from that description of the comic and the creator that this guy has a sense of humor, but the humor definitely does come out in the comic itself.
Yeah, absolutely. Because that's the Pied Piper story is obviously old as the hills at this point, right? But he takes even though the setting of it is this kind of old, almost medieval town, it takes the politics of it is kind of driven, or seems to be a lot more contemporary, right? The politicians are very much what we would think of as more contemporary politicians, not the mayor of some village in 1600, right? Even though that's pretty much what the setting is. There's this contemporaneousness to the personalities, the actions, and that kind of thing. So it's and he uses that to, I think, good comedic effect. Right? Is we know this story, we know how it works, but putting it in this, even though it still has this kind of original context of the setting, the characters are given this new, like I said, more contemporary mindset that makes for an interesting and almost humorous contrast in a lot of cases.
Mm-hmm. So let's talk a little bit about the, I guess, experimental, even multimedia aspect to Hobo Lobo of Hamelin. And I'm not sure what you call this process, but what Živadinović seems to do is to layer the art in such a way that when you scroll through, and you can do this through your mouse, depending, I guess, on what kind of mouse you use, or you can click through the various parts of what he calls each page. What is in the foreground moves quicker than what is a layer or two or even three back, so you have this sense of depth. It's very much like when you're traveling in a car, those things that you see out the window that are very close to you or relatively close to you go by very quickly, but objects from a distance tend to go by much slower, and that's kind of the effect you get as you scroll through this webcomic. So that gives it a sense of depth animation, but also there are sections of the art where even if you stop scrolling, you do see actual animation. So a figure moves across the screen, a bird or an object. And there are parts where music is involved as well. I know this becomes most prominent in page 3, and this is when Hobo Lobo actually does get the rats and lead them out of town. He lead them out of Hamelin. And if you make sure that your sound level is up, then you will hear the music as you're scrolling through page 3. But there are 1 or 2 other pages that also have some music to them.
Yeah. And I think it's... And I think as soon as you take a look at it, I think it's very clear why, even when he was updating it a lot more regularly, why it wasn't like a daily or even weekly webcomic, right?
Oh, no, there's a lot that goes into this.
There's clearly even at just looking at a superficial level, there's a lot that's going on in how this is built, how this is set up. There's just a lot going on any given page and any given update. And it's interesting, the format, each of these pages or chapters, however we want to call them, is essentially one long horizontal ribbon that leads from one panel to the next. So it's not, here's a panel, here's a panel, here's a panel, here's a panel. It's one canvas that just runs an entire image throughout the entire width of that screen, however long that is, however long he needs to take it. Some of them seem to be, only 5 or 6 quote unquote panels. Some of them are like 8 or 10, however much he needs to tell the story. But it's one long piece of art that, as you were saying earlier, kind of has these different layers. So the stuff in the foreground moves at a different pace than what's in the background, and different from the I think he's actually got 3 middle grounds, I think, right? At least 2. So there's the one page that I referred to earlier, and I want to even go into more detail in a moment, page 3, there, I don't know how many layers we have here. I mean, we have multiple layers, more than 3, it seems, that are going on as you scroll through. That make it, I think, page 3 the most complex of the 7 that we have so far. Yeah, and on top of that, again, going with he's got these different layers, but with the continuous scroll effect too, right? So, I honestly, I don't know quite how he's got it figured out so he can bleed one to the next so that it makes sense on all of those separate layers at the same time. That's just the logistics of that alone would be, I think, very, very cumbersome and difficult to figure out.
Oh, exactly. And see, this is one of the things that is so impressive about Hobo Lobo of Hamelin, especially when you compare it to the vast majority of other webcomics that are out there. I mean, not only is Živadinović dealing with the art, he's also very invested in design in a way that other web creators are not. Now, I'm not suggesting by any means that webcomic creators don't think about things or have to worry about design elements with their webcomics. They certainly do, but this is a completely different kind of design problem, or at least challenge would be a better way of putting it, because what Živadinović attempts to do is to give this sense of, I think, visual thickness, again, depth, as you're scrolling through, and this is what leads to most of the animation that we see here. And that's just a design element or design elements that most webcomic creators don't even have to worry about.
Yeah. And, that makes it a fascinating challenge then to do something with, is really the only way you can see this is on your desktop, right? The way this is set up and formatted, not only could it not be printed to the same effect. You could, I suppose, do some kind of, variation on things and make a lot of modifications, and I can still get the story into a printed format. But it certainly would not be the same impact or the same effect by any means. But it also doesn't even translate to like a mobile device at all, really.
Okay, that's interesting. Now, did you read this originally, or have you read it on a mobile device?
I tried, and at least on mine, it was not working well. So I just said, you know what? No, I'm not going to worry about it. But and then I went back and I kind of double checked, and he actually has a note in his I don't know if it's about page or whatever you want to call it. It says, if you're visiting on an iPad or iPhone or Android or mobile, whatever, don't. Mobile browsers in general are a can of worms, which I have tried and failed to solve time and time again at great expense of effort to no result, and I give up.
Okay.
Maybe I'll make a native special editions versions for mobile when I'm done. Ideas for dev environments welcome. Love looks nice. I presume Love is a development platform I'm not familiar with, but
yeah.
But yeah, he's basically said it's not going to work on a mobile device. He flat out recognizes that. He says, I'm not even trying. I'm not even going there.
Okay. See, I've read it on both a tablet, my iPad, and my desktop. Now, the desktop by far is the better, more enjoyable reading experience. I have not tried it on my iPhone, and I wouldn't. This is just not the kind of webcomic that you would consume comfortably on a smartphone, let's say.
Mm-hmm.
But a tablet's a little different. Now, what I did was at one point I took my iPad and turned it horizontal, and I was able to scroll through slowly fairly well. I had no problem with the movement and the visuals. What I did have a problem with is that I couldn't hear any sound. And
okay.
I did make sure that the sound was on and the volume was up on my iPad, but I still couldn't hear anything. Now, maybe I was doing something wrong, but it was, given the smaller screen, a little more limitation when it comes to the viewing experience. I also would have to scroll or move the screen a little up and down with my finger, not just horizontal, left to right, but also up and down, sometimes to read all of the text underneath a particular part of the ribbon as we scrolled through. On a computer screen, it's bigger, and you don't really have to do the same kind of up and down scrolling to get all of the text in some places. And I do get the sound on my desktop computer. So definitely the more enjoyable option is the desktop, where you have a larger screen. But it's possible on at least my iPad.
Yeah, and well, this is I don't know which version you have, but he was probably writing that when he started the comic, back in 2011 or whatever. So it's possible just that the software has updated enough to kind of catch up to a desktop available version.
Right.
But I think it goes back to it's certainly not something he's focusing on in terms of development, or he's never looked at. At least he's never solved for, and looks to have no intention to try and solve for at this point. So definitely something that if you're going to read it, to get the full experience, your best bet is to look at it on a desktop.
Right. I want to go back to something that we had mentioned earlier about Hobo Lobo of Hamelin, and that is its humor, Živadinović's sense of humor. It definitely comes out in almost every page or chapter, if we want to call him that. The way that he draws, for instance, the mayor. Well, first off, his form of drawing, I think, is very humorous, and not just cartoony art kind of humor. I mean, there are parts of it that are a little cartoony, but it's a very detailed, stylistic type of illustration. But it seems to me it reveals much of the humor, the way that he draws his characters. But even the characters and the way that the main characters and how they're represented, even their names. So the mayor many times is referred to as the mayor, but it seems that his name is Dick Mayer. At least that's he's referred to Dick Mayer a couple of times, and on the campaign posters that we see about town, the name Dick Mayer is up there. And so if that is indeed his name, then there's much of the humor right there, Dick Mayer. And if his last name is Mayer, maybe he is Mayor. I'm not exactly sure. I couldn't figure that out. But there is quite a bit of humor in his name and the way that he's drawn and how he acts.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, there's definitely I think there's a lot of little kind of nods throughout the story that just are just kind of make that little humor there if you're willing to look for it, right? It's a lot of it isn't terribly overt, and here it's a slapstick kind of gag or something.
Mm-hmm.
But if you sit down and look and watch some of the background stuff, like you said, some of the political posters and whatever, some of what the minor characters are doing in the background, I think there's a lot of little humorous elements that are going on, and again, speak to his type of humor. I'm scrolling through. I missed one earlier. There's a bit in here. Where is it? I just lost it. I think it's on page 2. Where Hobo Lobo first comes to town and he says, "Hey, I'm here to help people," and everybody is a line in there that says everybody's coming to him with their problems, and you see in the background two people or two animals, I guess, holding up a giant IKEA box. It's just a little thing in the background, and it's not a big problem; it's a little problem, but it's their problem and it's a modern one.
Right.
Here. Helping people with their 1040 forms, doing taxes and painting kites and teaching people to play harmonica and all sorts of fun stuff. But yeah, I think a lot of that. The story itself is it's pretty straightforward, right? Again, there's the Pied Piper story. It's not all that different than the one you already know at a high level, and it's just kind of like these nuanced details that are kind of running in the background, his specific take on it that makes it entertaining and funny and amusing, that in a way that the old version you read as a kid wasn't.
Right. Yeah. I like what you had to say about those little touches of humor sometimes that are in the background, and sometimes though they're right there in your face. And I want to use as an example here something I've already referenced a couple of times, and that is page 3. And the reason why I keep bringing this up is because I think this is the most ambitious page or chapter, if we want to call it that, in this webcomic. And the humor here began. Okay, so I'm looking at page 3, and it has, as you scroll through, 17 segments, or I guess what would be the equivalent of 17 panels, right? Because as you pointed out, we don't have sequential panels, one separated from the other, but they're sections that as you scroll from left to right, you go from one to the other. And when you begin this page, you see that it's nighttime, the rats are outside, and they're running towards something. You're not exactly sure what this is. And this is one of those pages that employs sound, and not just the music of Hobo Lobo, but also the sound of the forest at night. And so it's really nice if you have your sound up for this. So as we scroll across, I'm looking at the rats, some in the foreground, some in the background. They're following something. We realize that it is indeed Hobo Lobo. We get a silhouette of Hobo Lobo, kind of a classic Pied Piper of Hamelin kind of vision, that he's leading these rats that are much smaller than him behind him. And then at about a little more than halfway through, and I'm in section 10 and then 11 here, things turn weird. First off, the color goes from a grayish blue tint to a red, kind of fiery look. And here's where things go really psychotic, because whereas the first part of this page we had the rats lining up and starting to follow the sound of Hobo Lobo, but then in the last part of this page, as we're scrolling to the end, a lot of really weird images pop up that seem to have nothing whatsoever to do with what we've just seen. So, for instance, we see a lobster, we see a rotating artichoke, we see asparagus, we see a young boy with a tray with wine on it chasing a pig with a knife and fork in his behind. There's a couch, there's a sink, there's rotating pears, there's a flying chicken carcass. There's socks, a hat, a tie, a shirt. There's a little baby riding a bottle of champagne with weird-looking eyes. And then toward the very end, there is a creature that looks like the Buddha that's dressed as a doctor, and one of my favorites, a naked Statue of Liberty. And so it's just completely psychotic. Now, what is this supposed to represent? Where the hell did Hobo Lobo take these rats? We don't know. But if these weird images in the last part of page 3 are any indication, it's weird.
Well, and just
funny.
Yeah, but just to emphasize the weirdness too, it totally changes style too, right? It's not just, we're going along with his little cartoony drawings.
Oh yeah, that's right. I didn't point that out. Yeah, these are actual images that he's incorporated into his art. Right.
Yeah, and it looks like kind of a pop art, collage from the 60s or something, right?
Yeah.
So yeah, it really, really emphasizes the distinct difference of what the hell just happened here. This is different.
Yeah. This is definitely a webcomic that I think our listeners should go to appreciate what we're attempting to say. Sometimes we have a hard time trying to describe visuals through an audio medium, but I think for the most part we're able to do it. When it comes to a comic like Hobo Lobo of Hamelin, oh wow, I mean there's just so many weird things, multimedia things going on that trying to describe it only takes you so far. You have to go there and experience it for yourself.
Yeah, and I think it's unfortunate that it hasn't been updated in as long as it has, but I still think it's worth checking out just to see what he's doing with the medium.
Right.
It's, is it the best art? Well, that's subjective. Is it the best writing? Again, subjective. I like both, but it's incomplete. So there's only so much you can say about it. And then, it's been 2 years. Is he ever going to get back to it? I don't know. But looking at it just from the standpoint of here's what's possible, I think it's worth checking out just to see that if you haven't already.
I agree. Well, Sean, it's that time in the episode where we check in with our friends, Jim McClain and Paul Schultz, and see what's up with their webcomic in process, Poe and the Mysteriots.
And we're here with Paul Schultz, Jim McClain. Once again, guys, nice to have you back. Welcome again. Let's just talk about where you are and what's been going on lately. I think last time we talked, about a month ago, Paul had thrown Jim under the bus for not getting enough work done. So what's been happening in your guys' world for the past month or so?
Yeah, any bus throwing?
Yeah, Paul, what's going on?
It was more of a friendly push. No, I think page 5 I'm up to is on the drawing board, so I just didn't get it finished in time for. I was hoping to have it done and sent off by now, but I didn't get it quite finished yet. But yeah, so that's where I am. I'm on page 5. That's the last page we have. That's the last page we have thought out, I believe.
Yeah. So really, nothing has been done. But this is an example of what you want to have on your show is explaining what's going on. So I can say, well, let's see, I had a water heater blow up. My daughter's cat got violently ill, and I had to take her to the emergency vet. I've been dealing with my mom's estate. So, yeah, life happens.
I think that's important to bring up because I think a lot of people get started and obstacles pop up that they weren't expecting and just give up. But we're not giving up.
We're just a little bit behind, but I mean, we're not launching until January. We still have plenty of time.
Right.
Yeah. Well, I think that's one of the great things about doing this monthly update with you guys is to just demonstrate to the listeners that these things just don't come out of thin air, that especially if you're creators who don't have the luxury of doing this full time, right? Because if you have day jobs and you have families and everything else, these matters are going to come up. So how do you juggle the webcomic especially just getting it off the ground, along with all of your other responsibilities that deal with real world issues, right? And that allow you and your family to survive.
Well, when we figure out how to do that, we'll let you know.
Yeah, this webcomic is like number 4 or 5 on my priority list because I also have my other book that I'm assembling, and that got pushed back, and that's my priority because that has to launch in January no matter what. I have a big convention schedule coming up in 2017, and I'm going to use that platform to help to put the Mysteriads out and get that out there as well. So it's a multi-pronged attack, and it's actually low on my priority right now. When I see another page finished, it's like, oh, but we better sit down and get something knocked out here real quick.
Right.
But the thing is, we'll do that 3 or 4 pages at a time.
Yeah.
And then then we come back to it, letter it, and get it all done. So it's really not that bad. I mean, we still have a month and a half until January 1st, and when we already have 5 pages done. So since we're doing this on a weekly basis, we still have a good long buffer to work on, and by the time that comes around, we should have some more. So I'm going to guess we'll have 8 or 9 pages by then.
Yeah, and for me, I mean, honestly, I'm trying different techniques and whatnot when I'm in with the art for this page, these pages. So I wanted to, there's my joke is always done beats finished every time. As long as it's done beats perfect every time. But I kind of want it to be somewhere between done and perfect. So it takes me a little bit longer to do a page that way. So,
and if you're not familiar with Paul's work already, he is really killing it on this. This is his best work ever.
Thanks.
So let me ask you guys this then. So you're running a little behind. That's no big, like you said, it's not a big deal because you haven't launched yet. But let's say we get around to January 1st, and we've had more water heaters, more vomiting cats, more all of that garbage, right? And you really haven't made a substantial amount of progress in that time period. Or is that something then you'd still be willing to launch at January 1 with the less amount of a buffer than you had expected to? Or would that be worth pushing back?
No, man.
I wouldn't push back.
No pressure, no diamond.
Yeah, because I was wondering, do you feel that, once you do get going, even though you don't have as many pages as you would like when you launch, do you think that the fact that you've now launched would be incentive enough to, make you guys strike a much quicker trot?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Well, yeah. And since my other book is going to be finished by then my time is freed up because I don't plan on starting anything new until I gauge the success of that. So I can devote all of my free time that I currently spend on Solution Squad on working on Mysteriad. So for my purposes, it's like, I have all this awesome time now. Now we can really plot some stuff out. I'm not worried at all. And
one of the things with me is I'm like usually all the stuff I've worked on in the past, I've done all the concept drawings and everything for the characters and for the vehicles and whatever, monsters, whatever. I've got those done well before I start the page count. But in this case, I think I brought this up before. We're designing as we go, so that kind of slows the process down a little bit. But it doesn't really slow it down. It slows down the page count, but not the process. Mm-hmm. It's like we're doing 2 jobs at once when you think about it.
Yeah. So you're still taking the same amount of overall time. It's just kind of being directed a little bit differently.
Yeah.
Basically. Yeah.
And there's also the problem. I haven't been able to get over to LaPorte to see Paul and sit down in person because we get a lot more done when we're face to face.
Yeah.
And when winter recess comes, as we call it nowadays, instead of Christmas vacation, when winter recess comes and I'm not in school, I have an entire week where my daughter is going to be in school and we can't really go anywhere. So I'll have plenty of time to go over and see Paul. We'll get several pages plotted out by then.
Well, I'm actually hoping for the day where he can stand there on top of the desk waving his arms around as I'm drawing the pictures that he wants me to draw, where we can actually work together in the same room. That's going to be an experience. I see that happening in the near future.
Yeah.
If we do have Jim jumping up on the desk waving his arms, I think we need pictures to include with this podcast.
Or video.
Or video, even better. Yeah.
And I'll be shouting, "Oh, Captain, my Captain."
It'll be on YouTube whether we want it or not.
Okay, well, maybe this is asking too much of you guys, but now, Jim, I know you've got some deadlines, the book and all. But at this point in not quite mid-November, do you want to make a prediction of where you will be the next time Sean and I talk with you for our December show?
So in a month?
Yeah.
Let's see. Yeah, I'll say we'll have 3 more pages done. We'll be finished with page 8.
That sounds realistic.
Okay.
And by finished, you're talking drawn, lettered, ready to go, ready to be published, right?
Mm-hmm. Lettering a page of Paul's work takes me about 10 minutes. So yeah, lettering, guys, I don't know if you realize this, lettering's not hard to do.
I have a feeling some letterers might disagree, but
well, they'd be wrong.
Well, and you can send all correspondence to.
Sure, you go right ahead. Jim at solutionsquad.net. Go right ahead.
My usual letterer that I would send stuff to, he would agree with you because I can send him an entire script and he'll have it done like in 3 days. So.
Yeah, I'm not Todd Klein quality, but the thing is, the job gets done. They're balloons. They're clear. The words are centered. They're spelled correctly. So I have also seen professional letterers in the industry work incredibly fast. That's why if you send something to Comic Craft, they only charge like $35 a page. It doesn't take that long. If it did, they'd charge a lot more.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, exactly.
Especially if you already have templates made for the balloons, which I don't. I make them all from scratch. I'm just kind of I feel more comfortable making them from the beginning instead of using templates that are already pre-made.
Okay. So you're saying 3 pages. So when we talk with you guys next month, we can start at that point. We can say, hey, how were those 3 pages?
They'll be done.
Okay.
Won't they, Paul?
Yep, absolutely. As long as when we settle on a recording date, I know well in advance, when that'll be. So
we need to have that deadline instead of the January 1st one.
Exactly.
Well, we will be checking with you guys next month to see how things are going with Poe and the Mysteriads. In the meantime, get your work done, but also take some time to relax, especially with the family around Thanksgiving.
Sure, we'll try that.
Let me know how that works out for you.
You've never been around my family, have you?
Well, let's just at least keep the cat from getting sick and keep the water warm, and we should be good, right?
Yeah,
bare minimums at least, right?
That's an Irish toast, isn't it?
Yeah.
Hot showers are underrated, I have to tell you.
Well, good luck in the work, guys.
Thanks.
Well, thank you.
Always great to hear from Jim and Paul. Hopefully we'll have we'll be able to hold them next month to those additional few pages and make sure that they can keep going with their deadlines here.
Yeah, exactly. And, as we did discuss with them in that brief update section, we kind of expect things like this to happen, right? Life gets in the way. They have other things going on, family and other obligations, and so they may not be on top of everything every single month.
Exactly, and that's part of what I think is useful for us talking with them is just to show everybody what this process is really like. It doesn't come; these webcomics don't come to their screen fully formed and ready to go. There's a lot of hard work that goes into them, and that includes juggling broken water heaters and sick pets and all that kind of fun stuff too.
That's right. Well, whereas Jim and Paul have a webcomic that they haven't even put up yet, let's turn to the last webcomic that we're going to be looking at this month that is already completed. And this is Runners by Sean Wang. And you can find this at Runners Universe. That's one word, runnersuniverse.com. So this originally ran from February or March, I guess February a cover page went up, so February or March of 2009, and then it ended July of 2011. This webcomic is in 2 volumes, and I think both volumes are available in print, correct?
Yes.
At least at some point they were available in print. I don't know if they're still in print now. And this is a science fiction tale. The best way that I can describe this, it's something similar to Firefly.
Mm-hmm.
And in fact, I think Wang even references Firefly a few times in his notes.
Yeah, he's actually, from what I read, he had come up with this idea years earlier of these kind of smugglers just trying to get by in the universe, and they got their spaceship. They just cart supplies around for whoever's willing to pay for it. He thought this was a great idea, started developing it out. And the original, my understanding is the original came out as a pamphlet one-shot, or maybe a short series, perhaps. I might be a little wrong on that. But originally had scheduled to come out in September 2002. Was updated in previews. You could order it. And it was all great. And it came out, I think a week after Firefly debuted.
Oh, really?
He was. And so he saw the show and was like, oh my God, it's the exact same idea. and he makes reference to it, like you said, a number of times. He's fully aware that there's a lot of similarities there. They're totally coincidental, though. It's just not. It just was a story he liked. He's a story he wanted to do, and it happened to bear a lot of similarities and hallmarks that happened to come up in Firefly as well.
Yeah. Now, the main difference, though, between Runners, the webcomic, and Firefly, the television show on Fox, was that with the latter, it was populated by humans, right? And it was a rarity that we saw a creature other than a human. But in Runners, we have a variety of alien-type creatures that look like alien creatures. And in fact, we have a crew of 6, and of the 6, 2 are humanoid, and 1, she goes by the name of Sky, and they find her in the first volume. I don't know if you'd call her a human, because she's something... She looks humanoid, but she's something very different, and we never exactly find out what she is, but at least she looks humanoid. But the other characters that we have in this series, Roka, Rill, Benassad, and Sember, these guys are definitely aliens.
Yeah, and then the one other character who we're pretty sure is actually human has some kind of weird... I don't know what you call it, kind of anthropomorphic arm that seems to be some kind of energy gel something or other.
Yeah, that's never explained. His name is Bosch or Bocce or Bokeh, Bocce.
Yeah, I couldn't tell you.
Yeah.
I'm terrible with names like that.
Yeah, and you mentioned that there's something about his arm, we don't know exactly what it is. There are a number of things about Runners where we have a situation or we have some kind of context, and it's never explained. I'm okay with that. And it strikes me that is something that maybe Wang probably baked into the webcomic. It's something that if this webcomic went on and it continued beyond 2011, that many of these mysteries or questions that we had reading this would eventually be answered. But the fact that he doesn't answer these questions definitively. So, for instance, who is Sky, or what happened to Bocce's arm? We don't know. What about the original relationship between Roka and Rill, and then a character that they see in the first volume named Grissom? We don't know, but that's okay. I think the story works really well, even without those questions being answered.
Yeah, and I think that's largely stuff. I get the impression in reading the story that Wang has actually answered all of these questions for himself already. He knows where this weird arm came from. He knows all about Sky's history. He's got all of this stuff mapped out in his head, and all of that informs the story and informs the relationships of the characters and why they're all doing what they're doing. But he doesn't necessarily make it explicit, and that's something that I've always thought was. Well, maybe not always, but I was made very conscious of that in the late 70s when I sat down and watched Star Wars for the first time. Right? If you start watching the original A New Hope movie and you watch it in isolation, there's tons of references in there to things that are going on that you have no idea about, right? You've got Greedo coming after Han Solo about some kind of botched job and something about Jabba the Hutt. And we all know Jabba the Hutt now because of Return of the Jedi and et cetera, et cetera. But at the time, nobody knew that. And you just were, okay, yeah, so Han Solo has this weird, shady past, and that's all you need to know. We'll just keep running with it. And I think a lot of that kind of storytelling is here in Runners as well, is that there's a lot of these hints of stuff going on in the past that you don't really need to fully understand, just know that they're there kind of thing.
Exactly. Now, again, the difference between Runners and Star Wars is that in Star Wars, we did get other movies that eventually answered many of those questions. Here, I mean, it doesn't seem like we're going to get any more Runners. It'd be great if we did, but even if we don't get anything beyond these 2 volumes, and these 2 volumes are called Bad Goods and then The Snow Job, if we leave it there, still I think the stories work really well, even with those mysteries.
Yeah. But, and I think that's something, like I said, I think Wang has sorted a lot of that stuff out. It informs the story, it informs those characters, but not necessarily necessary to the specific plot that's going on.
Right. Now, I have to say, of the 3 webcomics that we're looking at this month, Runners by far was the one that I found most enjoyable. Not that I didn't enjoy Hubris or Hobo Lobo of Hamelin. I was fascinated by those 2 webcomics for very different reasons. Hubris, much more of a gag strip, and so how the dynamics of that webcomic is very different from the others. And then Hobo Lobo, just because it's extremely experimental, even though we don't have much to it yet, and it hasn't been updated in over 2 years, it's still fascinating to me. But when it comes to just a good, solid story, you cannot beat Runners. And ending this, it's an already completed, I guess, webcomic. It was a bittersweet experience because I enjoyed the story, but at the same time, when I got to the end of The Snow Job, I thought, I want more. If this is all we're going to get, I guess that's okay, but I would love to see more of Runners.
Yeah, I agree. I think he does a fantastic job. He's got some great characters, and it's like a lot of good stories, right? It's built off the good characters, right? And he's got this crew of 6 I want to say people. I don't know if that's necessarily the right word with all the aliens, but he's got this crew of 6,
creatures,
and they all have creatures, sure. And they all are friendly with one another, but they all have very different personalities. And a lot of the fun is, and a lot of the enjoyment is getting that interaction of those personalities and why this guy is, this way and this other guy is this other way. And sometimes they butt heads a little bit, and that's kind of fun, but they're still friends at the end of it. And there's a lot of that going on. But on top of that, particularly with Snow Job, it's a really interestingly complex storyline that he's got going on there. And it's one of those where, we're talking about these smugglers. They're on some job. The job goes south for whatever reason, and then they have to kind of get themselves out of it, is the basic gist of it. But in the Snow Job particularly, he's got double crosses and triple crosses and double crosses and all this kind of hidden plots and stuff, which it strikes me as a very dangerous proposition as a writer. That's something that you could screw up very easily, but he does a fantastic job of all of that. All of these kind of flips and changes of luck, and the guy who you thought was on your side really isn't, and all that stuff. All of that worked fantastically well. I thought it was very well thought out, and showcases, I think, as his chops as a writer, as a storyteller, to a very high degree, on top of being just a darn good artist.
Yeah, it is. And the difference between Volume 1, Bad Goods, and Volume 2, Snow Job, is that the latter is in color, whereas Bad Goods, the first volume, is in black and white. And Wang even describes at the very beginning of Volume 2 why he wanted to go the color route for this second volume. Both work really, really well. And what we find in Snow Job, and I agree with you, I think of the two volumes, this is the more complex. But we get some of the setup of what we come to understand in Volume 2. In Volume 1, we do know that the crew of runners is working, they're freelancers, and when we first see them, they have fairly steady work with a particular Dhamma, and Dhamma is spelled Dhama, and think of a Dhamma as like a crime boss, a Don. And so the crew are working for a particular crime boss or a Dhamma, getting steady work, but then what happens in the first volume makes the crew, our protagonists, high profile, and so the Dhamma that they work for thinks that it's too much of a liability for them to continue working for him. And so when we get into the second chapter, we have a crew that, like the crew of Firefly, are down and out. They're not getting much work, and they're scraping by with as much as they can. And so they try to get in the good graces of another Dhamma who gives them this job that seems to be easy on a world that is largely made up atmospherically of snow, thus the title of Volume 2, Snow Job. And they find out that there's much more than they thought about this job, that it deals with quite an elaborate drug ring. And it's a sophisticated drug ring, right? It's not just running the drugs, but also it deals with a community that is dependent on the drugs because their citizens are physically dependent on the drug, as well as, I guess, psychologically. And the criminals know that, right? The pirates know that. And so then that's where much of the tension and the conflict comes. The drug running and the manipulation of the population through the use of drugs or the potential withdrawal of the drugs. And our protagonists are coming into this unaware. And so as they learn what's going on around them, things begin to unfold in a really interesting way. So, yeah, these are, quite sophisticated stories that are being told here. Again, just too bad we only have 2 volumes of runners.
Yeah, I'd love to see Wang come back to this. Like we've talked about with any number of webcomics and webcomic creators, you have to do what you have to do to make a living, right? So I understand that, he's got paying gigs that keep him afloat, probably more so than, doing his own webcomic. But I would love to see him return to this at some point to see more stories like you. I was disappointed when it came to an end. I'm hopeful, though. My understanding is the idea, he started generating the idea for this at least 10 years before he launched it in any capacity. Mm-hmm. And my thinking is that if you, as a creator, have a project that's gestating for that long in the back of your head, that's not something you let go easily. Mm-hmm. Even after he's gotten a couple of these stories out there, I think it's probably still kind of noodling in the back of his head. And my guess is we haven't seen more yet because either A, he's gotten other paying gigs that, puts food on the table, or B, he wants to make sure that he's got a good story for these characters and hasn't quite worked out all the details yet. And then if he comes up with something as complex as the Snow Job, I can see why that might take a while to kind of map that out and really have the story together in a solid format before he wants to tackle that.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Now, Wang, according to the About page, got his start, I think it's his start in comics, doing seasonal specials for The Tick, the comic, mm-hmm. From New England Comics. And then he went on from there to do work for a project called Meltdown for Image Comics, and then Runners. So I don't know what he's doing now. I hope that eventually he will get back to this. But he's definitely adept at what he does, and not just at the art and the sophistication of storytelling, but also when it comes to something that you mentioned earlier, and that is character development. There are certain characters in Runners that really do make this enjoyable, in the dynamic between certain characters. Now, the leader of this group of Runners is named Roka, Roka, and he seems to be fairly even-keeled. He knows, level-headed. He knows what he's doing. Someone though who has been with him for quite a while is he's the character with what looks like the dinosaur horn on his nose, called Rill. And Rill is sometimes a cigar-chomping, kind of rough, gruff type of character who doesn't put up with any BS. And he stands, I guess, in contrast to another character called Sember, who is a newer member of their crew. And I say that Rill stands in contrast to Sember, or at least these are foils of each other, in that Sember is the complete opposite of Rill, right? Sember's always smiling, he's always happy, he's kind of bumbling, good-natured, but when it comes to the thing that he's very good at, and that is shooting accurately, especially from a distance, he's professional. But he's a bit of a goofball. Which is not how you would describe Rill, although Rill is funny in his own right because he takes himself so seriously. Also, Rill has a love of weapons.
Yeah, there is the one scene which I think recalls back to, it was one of the Mad Max movies, I think, where they do a weapons check and he just spends 10 minutes unloading everything he's got right here. Oh, here's the belt loop thing, and here's this gun, and here's that gun, and here's the sidearm, and here's what I had in my pouch, and here's the hidden one I had up my sleeve, and that makes for some enjoyable experiences and little character bits. There's even another bit. I was reviewing it again this morning before we recorded, and he's gone through this whole sequence of getting rid of all his weapons and the other characters chiding him on, hey, well, you think you're overdoing it here a little bit? And then they get tied up with rope, and, oh, wait, they happen to forget that he's still got his belt buckle, which has a blade embedded in it, and he yells back at him. So you still think I'm overdoing it, right? So, nice little character bits like that, that make it enjoyable, even though, it's an action story. It's a adventure story. But there's still a lot of character there. There's still a lot of nice little light moments, even when they're not intended to be light. You've got a kind of darker, more grim character like Rill, but he still can provide some levity, even if it's unintentional.
Right. And then another character that we don't get to see much of, in the second volume we see more of it, especially his character and some of his background, and that is Benisod, or he's often called Benis. And he reminded me immediately of Ben Grimm.
Sure.
The thing, the way that he looks. He looks like a pile of rocks thrown together. And, he is the strong man of the crew.
Mm-hmm. And also it should be noted, too, a very moral character, too. Is part of what we get is one of the other things, going back to the snow job and to part of the conversation earlier, in that, we didn't get much of him in the first story. But when we get to the second story, we hear more of his background and how he came to join this crew and what prompted him to make the decisions he made. Right. And we get some of that backstory that I think Wang had that clearly figured out in his head when he was writing Volume 1. But then when he got to Volume 2, he's actually able to express that and have this character come out as, I've done some stuff in the past, but I have my lines. I have my own sense of honor and dignity, and here's where I draw the line on stuff.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and, even when it comes to the antagonists of this webcomic, for instance, Hamelin the Handsome. Now, we only see Hamelin the Handsome in Volume 1, but this is a guy who, I guess, is a, competing mercenary, and he is very vain, and he's called Hamelin the Handsome because he's a hit with the women, and he loves his own face. And he's very sensitive about anything that's done to him, so when it looks like his face is just a little scratched, and it's due to our protagonist, the runners, then he goes after them.
Kind of a Doctor Doom kind of thing, continuing with the Fantastic Four analogy, if you want.
Oh, there you go, yeah. Except a much more superficial Doom.
Well, yeah, of course.
Yeah. So this is like, if Doom were paired with Donald Trump.
There you go.
Yeah. So, yeah, I definitely like Runners. Worth checking out. Again, the website is runnersuniverse.com. So there you go, the webcomics that Sean and I looked at for November. We started off with Greg Craven's Hubris. After that, we looked at Hobo Lobo of Hamelin by Stevan Živadinović. And then we wrapped up with Runners by Sean Wang. And, of course, we also got our monthly talk with Paul and Jim to catch up with them on their upcoming webcomic that they're going to be launching in January.
Yeah, I'm looking forward to seeing that. It's been interesting, as always, and looking forward to seeing where they take it.
That's right. And if you want to find great comics, both the hard copy and the digital variety, then you have to check out the sponsors of this program, and that is Discount Comic Book Service. Go to dcbservice.com, or you can check out their sister company, mydigitalcomics.com. And after you do get your comics there, get in touch with us and let us know what you're going to be reading. If you go to our website, comicsalternative.com, you'll find that you can leave us a voice message through SpeakPipe from the comfort of your own desktop or portable device. Or you can pick up the phone and call us the old-fashioned way. Our phone number is 415-3-COMICS. That's 415-326-6427.
And if you've got suggestions for us, comics you'd like for us to cover or think we might find interesting, you can email us at twoguys, TWOGUIS, at comicsalternative.com, or you can email me directly at Sean@comicsalternative.com.
Or me at Derek@comicsalternative.com. You can find us all over social media, such as on Twitter, Facebook, Tumblr, Instagram, Google+, Goodreads, Pinterest, and YouTube. You can subscribe to the podcast through iTunes. You can stream us on Stitcher. You can find us on TuneIn, on Spotify, and on iHeartRadio. And if you're an Android user, on Google Play Music. But you can still find every single one of our podcast episodes, as well as the reviews and the comics-related commentary that we post on our blog, by going to our website, which is comicsalternative.com.
Got quite the healthy list of ways to contact us there.
That's right. We're out there. We're all over the place, and we want to communicate with you, our listener.
Absolutely. Always great to hear from everybody.
That's right. And until next month, we'll see you later. I'm Derek.
And I'm Sean.
Take care.